What's going on, guys, and welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network and on Peacock. And today we're talking Season 1, Episode 5 of WWE Evil on Randy Orton. Now, I know it's been a while since I last broke down an episode of WWE Evil. Just been busy, haven't had a chance to catch up on the show yet. I know it was released over 2 months ago, but give me time. I will watch the rest of these. I will review the rest of these here on the channel at some point going forward, so I thought this week I would watch the Randy Orton episode, which I heard was one of the better ones, and it was. A lot like the first 4 episodes of the season of the show, though. If you're a lifelong wrestling fan, if you've been watching for any real number of years, then you really know everything there is to know about Randy Orton. This show does not teach you anything you probably did not already know about the Legend Killer, about Mr. RKO, about the multi-time WWE World Champion. It's a good, enjoyable watch, and I think they do a good job of getting you inside the head of Randy Orton. And really the best part about this entire episode, the career retrospective we've heard a million times about Randy Orton. The best part about the episode to me was hearing from Orton himself. You know, all these years later, and the timing couldn't be more perfect because obviously 2002, or rather 2022, marks 20 years since 2002, the year that Randy Orton debuted on the WWE main roster. We celebrated 20 years of RKO 2 months ago, back in April. They had that whole celebration for him, all that other stuff. So, it's kind of cool that I thought this episode aired soon before that, kind of celebrating the career of Orton and respecting and appreciating him for everything he's done, brought to the table in the last 20 years. So, it's a good episode. Really not, the entire show really isn't worth watching if you know everything there already is to know about WWE and these performers and the superstars and the company and storylines and stuff like that. But for what it is, I enjoyed this episode. I thought it was one of the better ones, if only to hear from Orton himself. And you probably saw the clip when the show first came out on Peacock back in March, but the opening sequence of this episode was by far the best part about it. When Orton talks about his process for getting, it's like literally the first thing they show on this episode. It was like one of those excerpts of an interview that he does on this episode. One of those like in-depth looks as to how, this is how he becomes Randy Orton, the character on WWE TV. And they don't replay this later on in the episode. This was the clip that was surfacing on social media, that surfaced on social media a few months ago. It was him talking about how he lets the blood rush to his head and he gets like fucking crazy and all this other sort of shit. So it was really cool. That was the best part of the episode to me. But from there, they kind of spend 5 to 10 minutes from all these talking heads. I won't name people by names. It's, they have Michelle Beadle on here, Shawn Michaels, Bruce Pritchard, among other people. It doesn't really matter who said what. But they talk about how he likes to make his opponent's life miserable. He's conniving. He's more mental than physical. They talk about the Legend Killer gimmick and how he's a great technician. They talk about how the RKO is the perfect finisher for him and how it became a meme at one point. But the more interesting stuff comes about, again, like I said, past the 5-minute mark when we hear from Orton himself. When he talks about how he didn't have confidence as a kid. He never had a group of friends growing up. He calls himself a very insecure and quiet kid. We hear from his father, Bob Orton Sr., Bob Orton Jr. I think his father is Bob Orton Sr. He's Bob Orton Jr., obviously. And he talks about how Orton was a quiet kid, and he would get into mischief, nothing enough to get him arrested, but, he would get into trouble sometimes. But beyond that, he was a good, nice, not responsible per se at that point, but respectful kid for the most part. Orton talks about the other side of the coin, and that, like I said, he was a quiet kid. He got bullied a lot, really up until like halfway through his high school career was when he really shot up, was taller than everyone else, was on the wrestling team, so people stopped bullying him as much. But it wasn't until later on in his career and in life when he became taller and stronger and bigger that, according to this fucking therapist they had here on the episode for some reason, I guess to talk about the whole evil aspect of his character, he was able to let out those frustrations many years later. So he actually followed in the footsteps of his father, not right away though. His father was Bob Orton Jr., as I mentioned, who did wrestling for work, and he was always on the road as a result. The mom had to take care of the kids, and the mom did not want that for Randy Orton. So when he was of age, he actually joined the military, did boot camp, absolutely hated it, saw things he didn't like and didn't want to deal with, which ultimately led to him going AWOL for 82 days. So he wasn't in boot camp for very long. He said, fucking, I'm out of here, went AWOL for 82 days, eventually turned himself in, and as a result, because they take that shit really seriously, obviously, he had to do time. I forgot for how long, but he was in jail for a little bit because of that. So when he came home soon after, He didn't know what he wanted to do, but his father thought he would be a good fit for the wrestling business. And Orton thought he would give it a shot, didn't exactly care about it at that point. So when he joined OVW, kind of rubbed a lot of people in the locker room the wrong way because he was already naturally gifted from the get-go. And he didn't exactly want to be there. He had a weird attitude about it. So I can understand why other members of the locker room in OVW, at that point WWE's developmental system, OVW, why they would be upset and why they would be envious and jealous and kind of rude towards Orton or whatever. So it wasn't long after his WWE main roster debut in April of 2002 that he injured his shoulder. And he was out for like 6 months or something like that. He was out for a number of months. But instead of staying home and resting and recovering and whatever, the company continued to bring him in to do pre-tapes every week. That was what led to the whole RNN stuff, and they talked about that here, and they showed some of the segments that he was doing. It was like dumb comedy fun. It showed that he had a personality and stuff like that, so it actually worked to his advantage. Showed up on Raw when he re-debuted a couple of months later. They talk about how his disruptive behavior behind the scenes was really what kind of kept him from taking off. And honestly, on a grander scale, that was really what kind of took him, what kind of prevented him from becoming the guy in WWE, as they probably always expected him to. WWE probably wanted him to be what John Cena ended up becoming. He had the look for it. He was naturally gifted. What he didn't have at that point was the responsibility and the maturity of what a top guy has or what a top guy needs to have. Orton didn't have that. He wasn't mature enough at that point. In early 2003, he joined Evolution, but it wasn't until early 2004 when he entered the feud with Mick Foley that he got really taken to that next level. And Foley, on his end, wanted a match that he could be proud of before he called it a career. Unfortunately, he had many more matches after that, but some very good ones, some not so good ones. But that Orton match was one of the best matches Mick Foley ever had in WWE. Easily, probably the number one best Randy Orton match that Randy Orton has ever had in WWE, just in general. But that Backlash match at 2004 was fantastic. It was Orton's toughest match up to that point. It not only proved that he wasn't a kid anymore, but not only also that he could hang with a legend like Foley, but also that he could beat him. And they talk about the Legend Killer stuff stemming out of that. And he was already doing the Legend Killer stuff for months prior to that point. But that was really the peak of it, I think. And they talk about how he wasn't ready for the stardom that he got at that point in his life. And he himself did not realize how big of a prick he was as he was. He was acting out, and he wasn't really the guy that WWE needed him to be in order to represent the company at the level that he was at that point in his career. He talks about how he went out drinking before the 2004 Hall of Fame ceremony. And I think it was the 2005 Hall of Fame ceremony. I wrote down 2004 here in my notes, but I'm pretty sure it was the 2005 ceremony because that was the year he inducted his dad. And the next night, his dad was at WrestleMania. He made a surprise appearance at ringside with Randy against The Undertaker. And then he got involved in the match. So I'm pretty sure it was the 2005 Hall of Fame ceremony. He went out drinking the night before. And he had to wing his father's speech. Did not have a speech prepared. He was clearly out of it. It was very obvious. And he thought he did a decent job. But looking back on it, it really wasn't that good. And if he has any regrets professionally in his career, it would be that. And the disappointment on his father's face really said it all, he said. He also recalls his substance abuse in 2005, how he took pills upon getting home from like a long night on the road or whatever, and he was already not doing well at that point, and he thought the pills would help him get to sleep, and they did, but he woke up in the ER, and he was very close to getting fired at that point. I thought it was 2006. He said it was 2005. I don't remember exactly, but it was around that time. But that was really the wake-up call he needed to realize, I got to stop messing around. I got to stop fucking up and really get my shit together here if I really want to make a career for myself and make a name for myself in WWE. So he went to rehab, cleaned himself up. He talks about how he used his experiences at this point, all the negative experiences throughout early on in his life and earlier on in his career, for good at work, he said, tying them into his character. So then they fast forward like fucking 15 years. I mean, this was a good episode, but they left out a ginormous chunk of Orton's career. Like, they went through the nit and gritty of like the early on phase, but I mean, they talked about the IED phase in 2009 and how he used those experiences for stuff like that, but they don't really talk about anything else in great detail. Like even the Triple H feud and leaving Evolution and being a babyface. Kind of they do, but not really. They skip, for some random reason, all the way to TLC 2020 for the Inferno match against The Fiend, who's not even employed by this company anymore. But he talks about how he got people to believe in him, with his acting and his mannerisms and stuff like that. We hear from his wife on this episode, and she talks about how he's become someone that everyone loves. And, I mean, they don't really talk about the Fiend stuff too much, but they recap almost the entire match for some reason. I'm not really sure why. I guess just because of how he sold it as it was real or whatever. I'm not exactly sure. But Randy talks about how when all is said and done, he wants to accomplish everything there is to accomplish, there is to do in WWE history. And he feels like he's well on his way of doing that. And so far, so good. And the key to his success so far has been consistency, he says. They talk about how the audience will always appreciate how evil Randy Orton is. And Orton kind of ends with this great little talk about how people will always ask him, oh, you have voices in your theme song. It's the name of your song. What are those voices telling you? And he always thought it was a dumb question because, like, that's just the theme song. But then he thought to himself, you know what? I did have voices early on in my life. And those voices were always kind of telling me that I wasn't good enough. And they were voices of self-doubt. Years later, nowadays, I still have those voices, but now they're telling me I'm content and I'm happy with who I am. As Randy Orton, not just the performer and whatnot, but Randy Orton the person. And I thought that was a really good note to end on. So the fact they left out like a good fucking chunk of his career was really weird. They jumped all the way from like 05 and 06 to 2020. They talked about the substance abuse stuff, which is good, because that was a very real issue he was dealing with. They cut out everything else that happened along the way, which was very strange. I honestly thought, even with that being said, I thought this was one of the better episodes of Evil so far. I mean, the thing, like I said earlier with these other reviews, is that you don't really learn anything new. You can't really go into the show looking to learn something new about Orton, because there's been a million different documentaries on the guy. We know everything there is to know about Randy Orton, but you have to enjoy it for what it is, the psycho analysis of his character and the evil side of his character and him being a heel and whatnot. I mean, it makes sense for that, and he is one of the better heels in the last, I would say, 15 years or so, it makes sense to include him in an episode on a show like this, but it was good stuff. I mean, none of these episodes are really must-see, but like I said earlier, I would think one of the better episodes so far of this season was this Orton one, just because of really the interviews with Orton himself, and giving him a chance to really look back and reflect on the person he's become and who he was many years ago. So those are my thoughts on the Randy Orton edition of WWE Evil. Thank you for checking out my review. I appreciate it. My apologies for having this review up so long later, so far after the fact, but I will have my other reviews up on the Stephanie McMahon episode, the Roman Reigns episode, and the Ric Flair episode in the remainder of Season 1 here on the channel very soon, so keep an eye out for those. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content, and hit the bell button as well to be notified every time a new video goes up. Have a great one, guys. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.